Started. Welcome. Is everybody enjoying NolaCon so far? I am too. Thank you for coming this afternoon to hear more tales from the CryptAnalyst. My name is Jeff Mann. I am a senior information security consultant at a company called Online Business Systems. There's my contact info. Feel free to reach out to me, Twitter, email. Somebody did actually call me a couple weeks ago, which was weird because people don't do that anymore. So I feel safe putting my number up there. Very briefly, because my company pays my way to come speak at conferences, just want to give a quick shout out to them. It's a company called Online Business Systems, which nobody's ever heard of. It's a 30-year-old company, mostly doing consulting IT services, but we have a security practice that started about 6 years ago. And it's actually the people that I used to work with a long time ago, and I'm back with them again. And because they know me, they let me come out and do this speaking. So thanks a lot to my company, Online Business Systems. I've been in the information security business for about 35, 36, 37 years. It depends when you count it as it started. My first job in the government was in 1984, so technically it's been about 35 years. But I used to have a job doing loan skip tracing in college, which kind of taught me OSINT skills. So I kind of go back 37 years. I do want to apologize right off the bat. In putting together this presentation, which is really a story about the last couple of years that I was at the National Security Agency, I very quickly realized that finding screenshots was going to be a little bit problematic because that's how we did screenshots back 25, 26 years ago. So I tried my best to find meaningful graphics to, work with the talk, but, bear with me. The technology's come a long way. I'm going to try to infuse throughout the talk, and especially to get you guys to interact with me a little bit. Every once in a while, there's going to be dates pop up. And when the date pops up, what I am hoping to do is ask people, what is the significance of the date? So let's do a trial run real quick. Does anybody know the significance of this date in history? If you know, shout it out. If you want to guess, shout it out. Anyone? Give up? If you don't know what that means, you're just going to have to wonder for a while or Google it while you're listening to me talk. So anyway, I was at NSA from 1986 to 1996 for about 10 years. In that time, I did a number of different things. Primarily, or the most of the time, I was there as a cryptologist, and I worked on both sides, both the defensive side, which we called InfoSec back in those days, as well as on the operations or the offensive side. So I technically was a CryptAnalyst and a cryptologist or a cryptographer, which means I designed codes and ciphers, and I also tried to break codes and ciphers. And I also then later on got into the things that we're going to talk about today. A couple of years ago, I had met somebody at a conference and at a speaker dinner night before the conference, went to his talk the next day, and it turned out he was giving a talk on sort of the history of cryptography or Cryptography 101. And the thought occurred to me, is like, wow, I know everything he's talking about. I used to do that stuff. So I thought I would put together a talk and turned it into a talk originally that was called Tales from the CryptAnalyst, which I have stickers. If you haven't gotten a sticker already, there's some up here. Because I worked for a company at the time that had a graphics department, and I talked them into making this cool graphic that's supposed to look like the old comic book. In that, I spoke mostly about the first 6 or 7 years that I was at NSA, and I always promised the sequel, which was what we're going to be doing today, so more Tales from the CryptAnalyst. Just very briefly, I don't know if you've heard my original talk or not, but I wanted to share just a couple things that sort of fit into the topic of our discussion today. I started out in what was called the Manual Crypto Systems branch on the InfoSec side of NSA. We produced things like one-time pads, which is what's up there on the left. The one-time pad is the most secure system available for protecting secrets that has ever been invented because it's not breakable. If you use it correctly, which, as the name implies, use the key one time, it simply can't be broken. unlike everything we use today, even though it might take tens of thousands or millions of years, there's still the possibility of brute forcing and getting to that solution. Not so with the one-time pad. One of the first assignments I had was I had a customer that came to me and said, we're using these one-time pads and they're a real pain in the ass because it takes us hours to write out the messages and do the encryption, but we got this thing on our desk called a PC. Is there any way we could use that to do the encryption? And I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense. It's not a complicated algorithm. It's just a matter of getting the key in electronic form. So I ended up, designing a system where on one end it was still paper, on the other end it was the one-time pad key on a floppy disk. And we produced this system that was semi-automated one-time pad. To my knowledge, and I haven't found anybody that has come up with anything else, this was the first software-based cryptographic system that NSA ever produced. Might have been the last, but it was certainly the first. In doing that, and this sort of ties into some of the hacker methodology or hacker mentality that I didn't realize at the time that I had, but I basically was working for an engineering organization that built little black boxes. And in fact, I had a chief scientist back at the time say something about, well, there's really no such thing as software. It's all hardware, because that's all that we did. And so I had design specs, and there was a process that you had to go through in order to produce a new system. You had to follow all these specs that were written for hardware, so I sort of had to hack the specs and rewrite them to make them make sense for software. And I had to sort of present the concept to, essentially the board of directors, all the senior management within the InfoSec side of NSA. I was a young guy in my early 20s, let's say mid-20s, months on the job, and meeting a bunch of old guys that were in suits, and they were all scientists and engineers, and they spoke a different language, and they were very serious. And I had to basically convince them to do something that had never been done before. And this is actually obviously it's a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that I redrew using some, basically what would be considered today paint. So I just kind of hand drew this, copying a Calvin and Hobbes, which is no big deal other than it just sort of talks about the fact that I had to rewrite the specs, and in doing that, I sort of broke a lot of rules. When I actually got the system fielded, the management said, well, you met all the requirements, you did what you asked us to do, but please don't do this again. One of the other things I did, one of my customers was the U.S. Special Forces, and in working with them, they used one-time pads. The algorithm that they used was based on this table on the left, which is called a Vigenère square, or Vigenère table, which is an offset of the alphabet, 26 different offsets. So you're familiar with Caesar cipher, which is a single offset. This is a combination of 26 different offsets. In working with that, it basically produces unique three-letter combinations, and that was essentially the algorithm. The Special Forces would memorize it. I was working with them and didn't have it memorized, so I was fumbling with the table. But I'd just been through a bunch of history of cryptography classes and learned about cipher wheels, and I thought, there ought to be a way to come up with a cipher wheel that does the Vigenère square. So I came up with it, and I was just using it for myself. To make a long story short, they liked it so much that we ended up producing like 15,000 of them and distributed to U.S. Special Forces. I bring this up and just sort of, this isn't the main topic, but it's kind of a neat thing that just happened a month or so ago. I was at CipherCon in Milwaukee, and a buddy of mine came up to me, and he knows I was a crypto guy at NSA, and he asked me if I'd ever heard of this thing called the Diana crypto system that was used by Special Forces. I was like, well, that doesn't sound familiar. So I Googled it, and I came up with this page, some guys making them out of wood. And when the guy, when I saw this, I asked my friend, I said, does that look like this other, go back, does it look like that thing? And he said, yeah. I said, well, that's because you're talking to the inventor. But the guy that made these things, he was approached by an instructor who was apparently ex-Special Forces at the Military War College in, I think it's Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and had given him a bunch of information on the history because he wanted to preserve the history. There was an email on there, and I got in touch with the guy, and I just said, that Diana crypto system, I invented it. Want to chat? By the next morning, I had an email back from the guy. So we've exchanged a couple emails. Long and the short of it, he sent me one of them. So if you want to see it afterwards, you can come up and look at it. The reason he was calling it Diana Crypto System, and it took me a little while to remember, it's because all the crypto that we produced at NSA had a sort of a serial number. It had a registration, sort of code of what it technically was, but there was also a code name just for short. And paper systems were traditionally named according to Greek mythology. And I remembered after looking at this that the one-time pads that Special Forces used were actually called Diana one-time pads. So that's where the Diana came from. That was like the first question that the guy had is, why do you call it Diana? Well, that's why. He actually sent me a whole bunch of puzzles. This guy makes crypto puzzles, and he tries to replicate cryptographic items, and he does it in wood. It's kind of cool. If you Google Diana Crypto System, you'll find this guy. If you want to pick up some of these things, they're kind of neat. My goal, and this is actually a picture that I found, actually the guy that had approached me had found on Pinterest of all things. And that's actually a production model of this thing that I learned that Special Forces came to call the Whiz Wheel. Anyway, I got a cash award for it, and my boss, who considered me a loose cannon because I did that other thing, when I was written up for this, the abstract of my award, it was titled "Man Reinvents Wheel." I've actually submitted a FOIA request because I would love to get a copy of that. I don't know if it exists or not. Second part of my NSA career, which would be much quicker, I was on the ops side, so I was breaking codes. I was there during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and I was down in the buildings that you're more familiar with if you've ever seen an aerial photograph. My one certification is I'm certified as a CryptAnalyst from the NSA, and that leads us up into what I call Chapter 3 or Part 3 of the NSA career, which is when I went back to the InfoSec side, which was actually technically my last tour as a cryptanalysis intern. I went to work for this group that was called Fielded Systems Evaluations. And the idea was simply NSA sort of made its living taking advantage of our adversaries sort of misusing the systems. They would do things like not change default settings. They wouldn't change keys as frequently as they were supposed to. Like the one-time key, the one-time pads, I guess to try to save paper, sometimes they might use it for a week or maybe 30 days or something like that. When you do that, you introduce cryptographic vulnerabilities and make the messages breakable. So somebody had the great ideas. We produce the best little boxes and the best cryptographic systems in the world, but how do we know our own people use them correctly? So we had this office that did fielded systems evaluations of our own systems. This is one of the devices that I worked on. This is I don't know if anybody's in the military has ever used this, but this was a device that would take a voice and digitize it and then encrypt the digital stream, send it to the other end, decrypt it, and hopefully take the digital back to analog so you could hear the voice. Usually it made you sound like Donald Duck. I don't know if anybody's ever used one of these. It wasn't perfect, but you usually got the messages. Oh, here's another date. Anybody know what this date is? This date really changed history, and this date is really why we're all here. So anybody have a guess? Not a clue? This is the date that not the first web browser, but basically the first commercially available web browser was released to the public. It was a browser called Mosaic, and as like I said, rudimentary, but this is what it looked like. This is what got everybody interested in the internet and doing everything on the internet. It's what got us all online. The internet existed before that, but this is what changed things. A combination of this and this. Back in those days, and I'm talking, obviously 1993, and I was in this office at the time, we had reference materials. And if you notice back then, everything was all internet security, because it was all about how do we take our existing computers and networks and tap into this global backbone that's called the internet. So these are some of the books that I used as sort of reference materials back in the day. Within the Fielded Systems Evaluation branch, I was in a little subgroup that was focused on network systems. And back before the internet was a thing, at least in terms of web browsing, what was mostly connected to each other on the internet was universities and research organizations, mostly with mainframes. And most of the information that was available was on databases, and it was very rudimentary, and it wasn't very easy to get to. But hacking was a thing. Anybody ever have read this book or heard of this book? This is actually a very inspirational book, and it was a book that was inspirational to us back in our office. And I bring this up because I have few fanboy moments, but about a month ago I was at a conference where this gentleman that wrote this book named Cliff Stahl, he was actually the keynote. Basically what happened to him was, and this was back in I think 1986, he was an astronomer at I think it was at Berkeley. I might get the details wrong, but basically back in those days you had to pay for your time on the mainframe, and so his group, he was going through the bill that he had gotten for like the monthly charges for doing work on the mainframe, and he noticed something like a 70-cent discrepancy. It was something really small. And in digging up why is there this discrepancy, he slowly realized that their mainframe had been attacked. There was somebody on it. And nothing like forensics existed back then. There was very little known about computer hacking in any way, shape, or form. And he kind of took it upon itself to figure out, what had happened. Long story short, it was tied back to, back in those days, it was the Soviet Union, and it was spies that was breaking into the university computers, because what's a lot of the research they did at that time? Government stuff, DoD stuff, military stuff. Anyway, I bring this up because I got a chance to meet the guy, so that's me getting a picture with Cliff Stahl just about a month ago. But anyway, so our branch, the couple group guys that I worked with, we started learning about hacking, what little there was, and we started applying that to the network systems. And of course, hacking started to become sort of popular and more well-known, and management, as it were, they decided to take over. And I don't know if anybody's ever worked for a bureaucracy, but management has a way of reorganizing, especially in the DoD. So they, in a short amount of time, reorganized us into what was called a Center of Excellence, known as the Systems and Network Attack Center. The purpose of the System and Network Attack Center, as I said, was to be the center of excellence. And the group that I was involved with, focused on networks. We were essentially learning how to hack computers, learning how to hack networks, and that's kind of what we focused on. We didn't have a lot to work with. There wasn't lots of conferences to go to. There weren't training courses. There weren't certifications. There weren't even really documented methodologies. We were just kind of coming up with it as we went along. We put a team together. The deputy director at the time, his vision was, all we need is a bunch of those long-haired, really smart kids, and we'll get a bunch of them and we'll beat the world. And of course, as you know, hopefully, when there's thousands, if not millions of people that are out there doing the same kind of thing, no one small set of people, no matter how good they are, is going to be able to compete against the world. So even in the very early stages, we were sort of running into the political, bureaucratic, well, this is what we want you to do, versus what we were learning about in terms of hacking and what we thought was the hacker methodology or the hacker mentality, and how do you do this thing called, we called it ethical hacking back then, we called it pen testing, penetration testing. At the time, the Air Force basically owned the network. I don't know if they still do or not, but back then they did at least. And they were sort of ahead of everybody else in terms of they had a network operations center, and they were the first, at least DoD organization, to set up a security operations center. So they knew what they were doing. So we went on a field trip to learn about what they were doing, because resources were scarce. There wasn't a lot to go to, but we knew that they were doing stuff, so we went to visit them. We met a couple guys that were Air Force captains. Gentleman on the left, Captain Zeiss. Gentleman on the right, Captain Waddell. Captain Zeiss on the left, he unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago now, I think. The guy on the right, Captain Waddell, I actually found him on LinkedIn, and actually, as I was putting this talk together, I had a chance to get on the phone with him and, reminisce, because we went to visit them, and then later on they came to visit us. If you're older, you may remember one of the first security companies that was formed was a company called Wheel Group. And like any good security company, after about 12, 15 months, they got acquired by Cisco. Cisco's been acquiring security companies ever since, and people still don't think of Cisco as a security company, but that's another talk for another day. We took a trip. They were located in San Antonio, and one of the cool things about being in San Antonio is they had this sort of Air Force museum, as it were. That was the U-2 spy plane. It had only recently been sort of declassified so that you could actually go out and look at one. The A-10 Warthog. That was a plane that was instrumental in winning the first skirmish in the Desert Storm. Those guys in the picture there are actually people that I used to work with. It's small enough, hopefully, that they're not identifiable. Plus, it was about 24 years ago, so we've changed a little bit. Of course, we did all the cool stuff at the in San Antonio, like visit the Alamo. We went to the River Walk, and that's where we discovered, which is probably one of the most important aspects of hacking. Trust me, the 46-ounce margarita. We only had one drink that night, so you can't say we didn't overdrink, but it did most of us in. Our biggest takeaway really from San Antonio was sort of the way that they operated in terms of a team. Back in those days, it was very common to have cubicles and have everybody isolated in their physical office space. But what they had done is they had pushed all the desks to the corners of the space and literally put a round table in the middle of their space. And if somebody was working on a research project, or somebody had a question, or somebody just wanted to bounce ideas off of everybody else, they would call round tables, spin the chairs, and everybody would come to the middle and huddle up. So we adopted that. So in forming this thing called the Snack, they moved us to a new building, and they put us in an office, and we designed our office much like this. So we had a bigger round table. Like I said, it's hard to find graphics that fit this talk, but it's best I could do. Our office, we nicknamed, because we were trying to be cool hacker kids, we nicknamed it the Pit. And the Pit is an office that exists. This is buildings that are outside of BWI Airport in Maryland. And the Pit was actually an office that was in this building here and pretty much in that corner of the building. I bring that up because a couple years ago there was a book came out called Dark Territories. Has anybody seen this book, read this book? A couple people. In this book, in the 4th chapter, which is titled Eligible Receiver, there's this following paragraph, and I like to read dramatically to you if you'll allow me. In the middle, it says, during its most sensitive drills, the Red Team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination locked doors. So somehow, the first group of people that were doing pen testing and learning how to do red teaming at NSA, and we were just a bunch of guys working together, trying to learn this hacker craft, and we called our office the Pit. Somehow that transcended into folklore that made it into a book. So we've got our little 15 minutes of fame there. You can go ooh and ah at that point. It was exciting because when the book came out, one of the members of the Pit got a copy of the book, and when he read that paragraph, he took pictures of it and emailed it to all of us and said, guys, we're in a book, we're in a book. It was very exciting for us. But to move on, because methodologies didn't exist, we worked on developing a methodology. We had to sort of work within, we were basically in uncharted territory. The existing rules of engagement didn't really apply, so we were sort of pressing the envelope as a good hacker would. You wouldn't stay within the boundaries. One of the most important rules was, that we came to learn later on, sort of twofold. One was, there's this thing called the NSA Charter, and the NSA Charter, which is still classified, so I can't kind of quote it to you, but it basically says, NSA should only do what NSA does to foreign entities. NSA should not do what NSA does to U.S. citizens. We can talk about Snowden later. But in combination with that, what we were really were encountering more on a day-to-day basis was the bureaucracy of, well, if you're going to do all these attacks and everything, you need to have permission to do it. And permission in a bureaucracy means lots and lots of levels of management having a say, which means, you know, it was paper back in those days. We'd have to write up what we were going to do, and it had to be signed off by all sorts of levels of management, and all the way up to the deputy director, and which meant it had to be passed from desk to desk to desk, and it would sit on the desks for days, if not weeks, where very often it might be a month before we got permission to do what we wanted to do. And of course, we're hackers. We knew what we were going to do. We knew it was going to work, and we wanted to do it right away. So that was very frustrating. You know, we gradually came up with a methodology, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to you. It's fairly similar to what we use today in terms of methodology. We call things different things these days, but you know, essentially we started out by doing what we call reconnaissance, or recon, because it was a military term, and we're a military organization. You know, find your target, determine what your target environment is, you know, which was a network segment, or you know, a Class C network or something like that, and figure out what was on it. You know, doing things that we now know of in terms of, you know, we use Nmap these days. Nmap didn't actually exist back then. You know, identify our targets, find out what they're talking, you know, what ports and services are open, figure out our attack strategies, do the attacks, write it up. Not a whole lot different from what we do today, except for we had to figure this out because nobody had ever done it before, at least not within our organization. I want to show you, you know, I mentioned Nmap we didn't have. I tried to write down some of the things that I know of that are common tools these days, just to sort of, you know, help to illustrate what we were working with back then. You know, basically we had to hack, you know, uphill 10 miles both directions in the snow type of thing. A lot of the things that are taken for granted these days in terms of tools, we just didn't have, or we had very rudimentary versions of what now are these tools. I even put that in the slide about going uphill in the snow. Look at that. So what did we have? I want to talk a little bit about the tradecraft, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So this is sort of tongue-in-cheek. I gave this talk at B-Sides Baltimore a couple weeks ago. There was a kid in the audience that got freaked out because he thought I was about to, you know, divulge a bunch of secrets. But bear with me. The problem we had was when we as NSA were targeting a system, anything that we did to try to target that system had to be classified at the level of the system that we were targeting, which kind of makes sense, sort of. But if we were going after a top secret network, anything we did was top secret. So in sharing with you what some of the things that were available back then might have been what we were using. I'm not saying we did use it. I'm just saying this is what was available at the time. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, you're with me. Okay? So we had network sniffers. They were devices. They weighed 30 or 40 pounds, and we had them on carts and would wheel them around to plug them into the network equipment in big machine rooms and data centers. So those are the things that we had in terms of network sniffers. We did have access to you know, what now would be considered a vulnerability assessment tools. Anybody remember Satan? Anybody ever heard of Satan? This is one of the first tools. This and another tool called ISS, Internet Security Scanner, were sort of the first vulnerability scanning tools that were made available as open source tools even back then. I'll mention it later, but I do a security webcast called Paul Security Weekly, and we actually had a chance to interview the authors of Satan last November, I think it was, Veet Savenema and Dan Farmer. I actually, coincidentally, met Dan Farmer for the first time. Don't even ask me what year it was, but it was here in New Orleans. I spent an evening with Dan Farmer on Bourbon Street. That's a story for a bar sometime. But anyway, I got a chance to meet these, so another fanboy moment I've had in the last year or so. Oh, another date. Anyone? I'm going to go quickly because nobody's guessing at all. November 5th, 1993 is when something called Bug Track came out. Bug track back in the day was sort of a digest, I think essentially it was an email list where people would talk about vulnerabilities that they discovered. So when you were trying to track vulnerabilities back then, one of the best sources was to go to bug track and search to see if anybody's talking about XYZ that you're using and have they had any problems with it, how have they fixed the problems. And a lot of it was just more focused on troubleshooting and trying to make things work. But it was a wealth of information for learning about targets and what they might be using, what they might be having difficulties with, and so on and so forth. So bug track was one of those cool tools that we had. This is an example of what a bug track write-up was. Somebody would basically write an email, and it was organized in such a way that if you replied to the email, it would sort of keep a digest. So in very rudimentary, but you could kind of sort of search it. There were many people over the years that took bug track and put it into a more digestible, searchable form. But this is what we had to work with back then. There was organizations like CERT, Computer Emergency Response Teams. There was various ones. They would put out notifications of incidents and, you know, either vulnerabilities that were discovered, or most of the time it was hackers doing their thing that was being discovered. You probably couldn't read it because of the small print. This was a real CERT advisory that was put out on July 4th, 1996, which was the release of a movie called Independence Day that talked about the vulnerabilities associated with alien operating systems. So it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but we had senses of humor back then. We did things, what's called OSINT these days, we called kind of open source. Again, we mostly called it Recon. There were rudimentary searchable databases or rudimentary search tools that were used to tap into what was mostly these mainframe databases. Things like Archie, things like Gopher. If you wanted to look up, what IP addresses or network spaces of organizations of your target, you could go to places and look them up. Back in those days, we didn't have private addressing. Everything had a publicly addressable address. So you'd buy a chunk, you'd buy a Class C, you'd buy a piece of a Class C, which is 255 addresses. And you have to register your domain. So a lot of information was sort of out there freely available. Gopher is another search engine. Before Google, there was a kick-ass search engine called Alta Vista. Anybody remember Alta Vista? Lots of hands there. That was our go-to search engine. And of course, there was Netscape, just the regular type of web browsing. The original Yahoo. Does anybody remember the original Yahoo? I should have found a screenshot. When Yahoo first came out, one of the features on the first page of Yahoo was sort of what they called roulette. You could click on it and it would just take you to a random website, because back in those days there was only like 100 websites, and they wanted you to experience the internet, so they would just let you go out to random places. We did target acquisition. Before Nmap, there was a program called Strobe. Strobe did TCP port scanning primarily. As I was doing this talk and I was looking up, when did things come out, because I wanted to make sure I was being accurate, I had the interesting discovery, and I'll ask it in the form of a trivia question. Anybody know who wrote Strobe? Assange, Julian Assange. I looked that up and was like, that's why I know the guy's name. When you used to launch Strobe, it would come up in a shell. It would scroll up and say, this is Strobe version whatever, written by Julian Assange. I was like, I always knew his name sounded familiar. I can't read what that was. It's another search engine. NS Lookup, it was a way to look up addresses, the names of systems, the IP addresses of systems. We had rudimentary network mapping tools. Another date. Anyone? I gotta speed it up here. I think I'm blathering too much. I'm doing okay. Crack, one of the first password cracking tools. Actually, I found not too long ago on YouTube, like in the last week or two, apparently Alec Muffet did a presentation somewhere where he kind of talked about the history of and evolution of crack. Very interesting. If you search, I should update this and get the link. But Alec Muffet talking about the history of crack. It's like a 45-minute presentation, really cool. Back in those days, it was all Unix systems. Passwords were contained as hashes in what was called the etc password file. They weren't hidden. They weren't protected in other files. They were pretty much, and this was a world-readable file, so anybody that was on the system could look at this file, and of course you could grab the hashes and try to break them. One of the common techniques of how we would get root on Unix systems was using something called setuid. Setuid basically was a flag that was set on the profile information of a file that would execute the file as the owner or the creator of the file. So if it was written by root, it would run as root. And the trick was, if you could get a program to hiccup and halt execution, very often it would just kind of dump out into a shell, but because of the state it was running in root, when it launched the shell and say, ooh, we just crashed, the shell would be a root shell. Very common method for getting root back in those days. I mentioned earlier we had the bureaucratic problems, we had that charter problem. This is sort of a summary of the charter, but again, the actual charter is still classified, so I couldn't show it to you. But we were having the issues of not only the bureaucracy, but also it came later, and I'll get to it, but also this issue of why is NSA doing this stuff? Quickly, another date. Anybody remember Pretty Good Privacy? Do we still use PGP? Another fanboy moment. I'm going to skip this story. We had a crisis within our office at one point that had to do with PGP, but I don't think I have time to tell that story. Buy me a drink later, and I'll tell the story for you. But again, last October, I got to meet Phil Zimmerman at a conference. So I've had a lot of fanboy moments meeting a lot of my idols in this industry just in the last year. It's been kind of cool. I am going to reveal one top secret tradecraft attack method that we used. And please don't let it leave this room. You don't have to pause it too. This was our primary attack tool when we were doing our reconnaissance. You ready for it? You laugh, but quite literally, if we wanted to follow the rules and issue a ping command just to see if there was a target out there, not yet alone whether it was responding, it would take us having to write it up and wait 30 days to get permission to do it. And the reason was, as we ended up talking to the lawyers, we called it general counsel, and their belief was, well, if you're going to attack a system, you got to follow all these rules, you got to get all these permissions, and they interpreted ping because it elicited a response from the target. They classified it based on the definitions of the day as an active attack. And if it was an active attack, it had to go through the 30-day approval process. That wasn't working for us. So we decided we were going to try to educate the lawyers, the general counsel, and for some reason I took it upon myself to sort of lead this, spearhead this effort. I think I was a business major, so I kind of knew how to talk plain English to people. I didn't always do the technical stuff, and I actually have a brother that's a lawyer, so I think, I don't know, for better or for worse, I took it upon myself to try to talk to the lawyers, to explain our methodologies, to explain that it was an imprecise science, to explain that a lot of what we did was dependent on what we saw. We didn't know going into it without looking at anything exactly what our attack methodology was going to be. So I set out to try to teach them more of the methodologies and more of the concepts and the way of thinking about things. Their thought was, well, just demonstrate all the 50, 100 attack tools that you have, techniques that you have, and let us understand them, so when a new job comes in, it was kind of like this a la carte mentality. Just tell us you're going to do a little of this one and a few of these and a couple of those, and we know what they are. We'll streamline the process and approve it rather quickly. So I would meet with them once a week. There was a popular show on at the time called Home Improvement, so I called it Tool Time. And we spent once a week, I'd spend like an hour, hour and a half with the general counsel, just trying to go through and teach them what it meant to do hacking, what it meant to do, and how you did reconnaissance, and how you did discovery, and the whole 9 yards. we were so good at what we were doing that word got out. I mean, we started out kind of doing, our own internal networks and obviously, DoD and military, which was all secret and top secret networks. But somehow, and I don't really honestly know how it happened, but word got out in other military, or I'm sorry, other government organizations, non-military. This is sort of a summary of an article that actually was written a few years after I left. I'll make these slides available so you can read the small print. But essentially, we were approached by the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice wanted to have their website, their internet presence, assessed by us. What we ended up doing, we called Vulnerability and Threat Assessment, VTA. And so we had a Vulnerability and Threat Assessment Methodology, VTA. You got to have acronyms in the military. And of course, the lawyers got involved in this, and the problem was NSA was responsible for classified networks. Who was responsible for unclassified networks at the time was NIST. NIST at the time didn't really have any capabilities, so NIST very routinely would sort of pass it along back to NSA with this convoluted bureaucratic political process. So we had to embark on this convoluted bureaucratic political process to be able to do what we weren't supposed to be doing, but it was kind of understood that we could do it if we followed the rules. You with me so far? What we had to do is we had to get the Attorney General, who at the time was Janet Reno. She had to write a letter to basically it was to the person that was responsible for this InfoSec stuff, basically asking a favor, saying, hey, can you do this for us? We know it's not really you that's supposed to do it, but we'd really like you to do it. So there's the letter. It's in two parts, but it was actually signed by Janet Reno. We came up with a response, and the response came from the director back to the DDI, to the guy on the previous letter, to go back to the Attorney General. If you can read the small print, it's from the director at the time. The very last line there, I was actually named as the point of contact. So this was a couple months process to try to get going to be able to go do a vulnerability and threat assessment of the DOJ web presence. We were all up to 21 August. The letter had been signed, it just hadn't been delivered. And right before it was supposed to get delivered, this happened. I got a call on a Monday morning from my contact at the DOJ saying, oh my gosh, our website was hacked. Help, please help us. Does anybody remember this? This was like the first hack of a government DoD website. So it was kind of a big deal. And not only was there no methodologies back then on doing vulnerability threat assessment pen testing, there was also no methodologies or procedures back then for doing forensics. And back in those days, if you had a website, you were hosting it on your own server and your own network, hopefully outside of firewalls, so it was internet facing. And when they realized that they were breached, the first thing they did was pull the plug. And then what was the second thing they did? Rebuilt the system. So whatever forensic evidence might have been there wasn't there. But we didn't know that at the time. I assembled a team, mostly people from our little office in the pit, and we went down to the DOJ for a couple days and set out to try to figure out what we could do to help them. 3 or 4 days into it, we actually got a phone call from the home office, and the message I got from one of the guys that was left behind was, the shit's hit the fan. You guys got to drop what you're doing now and come back. Drop what you're doing and come back. So, to make a long story short, somebody somewhere in the bureaucracy had gotten wind of the fact that NSA was at a non-secret, top-secret site doing things that are outside of the charter, which was when I became very familiar with the charter, because I was the ringleader. They put me under investigation. They essentially tried to fire me, if not prosecute me. Long story short, I was absolved because I had to be interviewed by all sorts of security people, and I said, we just were trying to help out. And they're like, yeah, what's the big deal? It was a political mess. We did learn a few things about forensics. I actually was one of the contributing editors to, I think was the first document that the SANS Institute put out about incident handling, like, preserve evidence, don't wipe everything immediately, try to start doing logging, put the logs, stuff that we now understand. It wasn't written down back then. we were basically, slapped on the wrist, reprimanded, and told, look, we like what you guys do, but if you're going to do what you do here, you got to you got to play by our rules. And we kind of said, most of us said, yeah, okay. So a lot of us left. There were technically 6 of us, and the sound is working. 4 of us have left and gone out into the private sector. 2 of them are still at NSA. The only one that I'm allowed to say publicly who was part of the pit is Ron Gula. He's the founder of Tenable Network Security, Nessus. Let me see if I can turn that off. There we go. We used to play that. We had it on our laptops, and when we were doing our thing, we were geeks, so we would play the Mission Impossible music. Anyway, so the aftermath is another date. And I think that is, going back to that book, Dark Territory, chapter 4 was called Eligible Receiver. Eligible Receiver was the first joint services-wide coordinated pen test red team exercise that was performed by NSA. It was done in 1997 in June. It was originally supposed to be like a 14-day exercise, and they had to pull the plug after 3 or 4 days because they'd broken everything at that point. It's interesting, they did a symposium, I guess it was on the 20th anniversary, I think it was back in 2017, where they invited a bunch of people in, I think, to the University of Maryland, University College, and they put some of the, these are all the bureaucrats and the political people got together to talk about all the cool thing that they did and that they coordinated, and you can read more about it in the book. I think the website is still active. They actually, for a little while, had a 20-minute video that had been put together back in like 97 or 98, kind of recapping the story. They redacted it, so it's about 8 minutes out of the 20-minute video, and it was up there for a while. I watched it. I didn't grab it, and then later they took it down. But they had like an hour, 90-minute, roundtable discussion, which again, I think they pulled the video on, but I think if you go and ask them for it, they might share it with you. Interesting history lesson. Another date in history, September 1st, 1997. That's when Nmap came out. We love Nmap. I used Nmap in the commercial world all the time. It was wonderful. Those of us that are from the pit, we still get together every once in a while, and the guys that still work there, they bring us gifts sometimes. So one of our meetings about 2 years ago, they brought us NSA secret sauce. You can get this all at the National Cryptologic Museum, by the way, and a little pen that actually has a sort of like a bat warning light. So that mug is the projection of the NSA seal, which is coming from the pen. Cool stuff. You can get it at the National Cryptologic Museum. So that's sort of the story, and I apologize for going quickly. There are more stories to tell, obviously. If you're interested and intrigued, it occasionally comes up. I mentioned I'm one of the hosts on Paul's Security Weekly, so you can hear me often there, and very often I will tell stories of old because it comes up in conversation. Hack for Kids is going on in Chicago right now. Hack for Kids is teaching hacking skills to young people. They put together a card game last year in sort of like one of these fantasy card trading games. I'm not a young person, I don't do it, but they have face cards, and I got to be one of the face cards, and this is the majority of the face cards. We were down, I think, 2 people. Leslie Carhart and Josh Corman were not present for that photo. They've actually released a second deck, and there's 5 more face cards that they call Anachronism. So if you want to do a fundraiser, go to that and buy the deck. It's educational because the whole game is all about the history of hacking and phreaking in more detail, but kind of the stuff I've been glossing over today. I was recently included in a book that came out in January called Tribe of Hackers. Anybody got Tribe of Hackers? Great. If you have it with you, I'm happy to sign it. If you don't have it, I encourage you to go to Amazon and order it, or just go to Tribe of Hackers. That'll get you there. It's like 15, 20 bucks, and all proceeds go to charities. I also was escorted one time to a talk by a bunch of stormtroopers, so I consider myself a Jedi Master. And probably what's most special to me is I am part of a group that's essentially a bunch of old people that get together once a year at RSA with Gene Spafford. If you go back early on in my presentation, one of those books that we considered the Bible, Gene Spafford's one of the authors. He's been doing this for like 75 years. He's amazing. And I was invited to join this group. It's invitation only. You have to be sponsored, and you get voted in or out. And in an interesting twist, the person that I have my arm around there, the guy in the red sweater, that's actually the lawyer that I used to deal with back at NSA. We didn't get along too well right after that incident that I told you about, and I didn't really speak to him for about 20 years, but we've gotten reacquainted, and he was the one that sort of introduced me and got me into this group. So we're buds now. Turns out he took more knives in the back and was protecting us from even more trouble than I did get in. So I thank him for that. I don't know what we're doing on time, but anybody have any questions, comments? Maybe like 30 seconds if anybody has any questions, comments. If you want to take me to a bar, I can talk to Snowden. Yes. I haven't been around as long. But I've been around for a while. Okay. I remember one of the things that we didn't have in the late 90s was security. Not in the commercial world. And they still don't. Yep. No, and that's true. Yeah. It's actually one of the things I've thought about, like I showed the book on, practical Unix and internet security and hunting the wily hacker, internet security. The belief back then was, let's just build a firewall, let's just protect us from the evil internet, and we'll be fine. Whatever goes on the inside, it doesn't matter, because all we have to do is protect ourselves from the outside. And then that mentality was flawed somewhat, as we've figured out, and it still continues very often today. So it's interesting, what we used to call internet security, we now call, I'm not going to say the word. You know what I'm getting at. Any other questions or comments? I appreciate your time. I've got these stickers up here, the Tales from the CryptAnalyst. I've got a few Security Weekly stickers too, if you'd like. Help yourself. Anybody wants to buy me a drink downstairs, I'm happy to talk Snowden. Thank you very much.